Imagine being born into royalty, only to watch a powerful foreign empire slowly invade your homeland. Imagine watching your people captured, your kingdom weakened, and your political rivals fight for control. Then imagine becoming the person standing between your people and the empire trying to conquer them. This is the story of Nzinga Mbande, of Ndongo and Matamba in present-day Angola, a woman who became a queen, a diplomat, a military strategist, and one of the most formidable opponents of Portuguese expansion in Central Africa. She negotiated with European governors, forged alliances with powerful African kingdoms, changed religions and political strategies when it served her people. And when diplomacy failed, she went to war. For decades, Portugal tried to break her resistance, but Nzinga refused to surrender. She survived political betrayal, military defeats, shifting alliances, and years of war. And when she finally died in 1663, she left behind a legacy that would survive for centuries. Today, she is remembered as one of Angola's greatest historical figures and one of Africa's most remarkable female rulers. But before she became Queen Nzinga, she was simply a princess born into a kingdom fighting for its survival. This is her story. Around 1583, in the kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now Angola, a girl was born into the royal family. Her name was Nzinga Mbande. She was born during a dangerous period in Central African history. Portuguese forces had established themselves along the coast and were pushing deeper into the region, seeking control of territory, trade, and access to enslaved people. Ndongo's rulers faced a growing threat, and Nzinga was born into a royal family that would eventually have to confront it. As a princess, she was raised within the political world of the kingdom. She learned the customs of her people. She witnessed the responsibilities of royalty, and she developed an understanding of diplomacy and leadership that would become critical later in her life. But Nzinga's childhood was not simply preparation for a comfortable life in a palace. She was growing up in a kingdom under pressure. Every political decision carried consequences. Every alliance could mean survival, and every mistake could cost lives. As Nzinga grew older, she would discover that her royal blood came with an enormous responsibility. Her people would need someone capable of facing an enemy that was becoming increasingly powerful, and eventually, that responsibility would fall directly onto her shoulders. By the time Nzinga reached adulthood, Ndongo was facing a growing danger. Portuguese forces had established themselves at Luanda and were pushing deeper into Central Africa. Their goal was not simply territory. They wanted access to trade routes and to the people being captured and sold through the expanding Atlantic slave trade. For Ndongo, the consequences were devastating. Portuguese military campaigns and raids destabilized the region, while rival African powers also competed for territory and captives. The kingdom's rulers were forced to make difficult choices: fight, negotiate, or risk losing everything. Nzinga watched as her homeland became caught in this struggle. She understood something that would define the rest of her life. Survival would require more than military strength. It would require diplomacy, strategy, and the ability to understand the ambitions of powerful enemies. That understanding would soon become one of Nzinga's greatest weapons. In 1624, after the death of her brother, Ngola Mbande, Nzinga inherited the leadership of Ndongo at one of the most dangerous moments in its history. She was no longer simply a princess watching events unfold. She was now responsible for a kingdom fighting for its survival. And her first great challenge would not be decided on a battlefield, but across a negotiating table. Before she became queen, Nzinga was already proving herself as one of Ndongo's most gifted leaders. Around 1622, her brother, Ngola Mbande, sent her to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. The future of the kingdom depended on those talks. Ndongo needed peace. Its people had suffered from years of conflict, and Portuguese expansion threatened the kingdom's survival. When Nzinga arrived, she was welcomed into the governor's chamber. But there was one problem. The Portuguese had prepared a chair for their governor, yet offered Nzinga no seat of equal status. Instead, she was expected to sit on the floor. It was a deliberate attempt to show that Portugal stood above Ndongo. Nzinga refused to accept the insult. According to long-standing historical accounts, one of her attendants knelt beside her, allowing Nzinga to sit upon their back so she could meet the governor at eye level. It was a powerful statement. Without raising her voice, without drawing a weapon, she demanded respect. The negotiations resulted in a temporary peace agreement, giving Ndongo valuable time. But Nzinga understood that treaties alone would not protect her kingdom forever. She had proven she could negotiate with an empire. Soon, she would have to fight one. In 1624, tragedy struck Ndongo. Nzinga's brother, Mbande, died. The kingdom was suddenly without the leader who had spent years trying to protect it from Portuguese pressure. For Nzinga, there was no time to grieve in peace. The future of Ndongo was at stake. She stepped forward and assumed leadership of the kingdom. But taking the throne did not mean the struggle was over. It was only beginning. Portuguese forces continued to push for greater control, while rival factions within the region competed for power. Nzinga understood that defeating Portugal would require more than a single army. She needed alliances, she needed loyal supporters, and she needed a strategy that could keep her kingdom alive even when the odds were against her. She began building relationships with neighboring peoples and reorganizing her forces. When diplomacy offered an opportunity, she negotiated. When negotiation failed, she fought. Nzinga also moved beyond Ndongo itself, eventually establishing a base of power in Matamba, where she would become ruler and build another center from which to resist Portuguese expansion. The Portuguese expected another African ruler they could pressure into submission. Instead, they had encountered a queen who refused to disappear, and the struggle between Nzinga and Portugal was about to become a decades-long battle for power, independence, and survival. Diplomacy had bought Nzinga time, but it had not ended the threat. As Portuguese forces continued expanding their influence, Nzinga realized that protecting her people would require a different kind of strategy. She moved her power base toward Matamba, a neighboring kingdom that would become central to her resistance. There, Nzinga built a stronger political and military foundation. She welcomed people who had fled Portuguese-controlled territories and strengthened her forces with new allies. But Nzinga understood that she could not defeat Portugal through conventional warfare alone, so she adapted. Her forces relied on mobility, alliances, and knowledge of the land. When the Portuguese advanced, Nzinga's forces could strike back. When the political situation changed, she changed with it. She negotiated when negotiation offered an advantage. She fought when fighting became necessary, and she understood that survival sometimes meant making difficult choices, even forming alliances with former enemies. For years, Portugal tried to break her resistance, but Nzinga continued to survive. The queen who had once sat across from Portuguese officials at a negotiating table was now becoming something far more dangerous to them, a ruler they could not control, and the war was far from over. Nzinga's resistance against Portugal was never simply about winning battles. It was about surviving long enough to protect her people. She understood that the battlefield could change from one year to the next, and so could the political alliances surrounding her. Nzinga therefore became a master of adaptation. She built relationships with neighboring African powers and worked with groups who opposed Portuguese expansion. She also used diplomacy, intelligence, and mobility to keep her enemies from gaining complete control. Her forces knew the terrain. They could move quickly, and they could strike when the Portuguese least expected it. But Nzinga was not fighting only for territory. Portuguese expansion had disrupted communities and contributed to the capture and enslavement of people in the region. For Nzinga, resistance was tied to the survival and political independence of her people. Over time, her reputation grew. The Portuguese had faced African rulers before, but Nzinga presented a different kind of challenge. She could negotiate with them, she could outmaneuver them, and when necessary, she could fight them. For decades, Portugal struggled to defeat her, and Nzinga continued to prove that her greatest weapon was not any single army, but her ability to adapt. For years, Nzinga had fought Portugal with every weapon available to her. But she understood that even the strongest ruler could not survive alone. She needed allies. One of her most important alliances came through the Dutch, who were also competing with Portugal for control of trade and territory in Central Africa. When Dutch forces captured Luanda in 1641, the balance of power suddenly shifted. Nzinga saw an opportunity. She joined forces with the Dutch and strengthened her campaign against the Portuguese. For a time, the alliance brought real success. Portuguese control was weakened and Nzinga's position became stronger, but the political landscape changed once again. In 1648, Portuguese forces recaptured Luanda. Nzinga was once again facing a powerful enemy, yet she refused to surrender. Instead, she returned to diplomacy. She opened negotiations with Portugal and eventually reached an agreement that recognized her position and helped secure peace. By this stage of her life, Nzinga had demonstrated something few rulers could match. She had survived through war, diplomacy, betrayal, and shifting alliances. She had spent decades fighting an empire that had once seemed impossible to defeat, and somehow she was still standing. But Nzinga's greatest challenge was no longer simply surviving. It was securing a future for the kingdoms she had spent her life protecting. By the late 1650s, Nzinga had spent decades fighting to protect her power and resist Portuguese expansion. She was no longer the young princess who had first entered the political world of Ndongo. She was an experienced ruler, a seasoned diplomat, and a survivor of decades of war. But Nzinga understood that victory did not always mean destroying your enemy. Sometimes, victory meant surviving long enough to negotiate from a position of strength. In 1656, Nzinga reached an important agreement with the Portuguese. The conflict that had consumed much of her reign began to give way to diplomacy. She was recognized as the ruler of Matamba, and the agreement helped establish a period of relative peace. Nzinga then turned her attention towards something just as important as warfare: building a stable kingdom. She worked to strengthen Matamba's political and economic position and encourage the resettlement of people who had been displaced by years of conflict. After decades of fighting, she had finally achieved something that once seemed almost impossible: peace. Nzinga had survived an empire that had tried repeatedly to defeat her, and now, in the final years of her life, she could finally begin thinking about what would remain after she was gone. Because a true ruler does not only fight for the present, a true ruler prepares the future. After decades of war, diplomacy, and political struggle, Nzinga had finally reached a period of relative peace. She was now an older woman. The young princess, who had once entered a Portuguese governor's chamber as a diplomat, had become one of the most formidable rulers in Central African history. Nzinga continued to rule Matamba until her death in 1663. She died at approximately 80 years old. Her passing marked the end of an extraordinary reign, but it did not mark the end of her influence. The kingdoms she had defended continued to remember her as a ruler who had refused to surrender when powerful forces tried to control her. Her story traveled through generations. She became remembered not only as a queen, but as a diplomat, a military strategist, and a symbol of resistance. Centuries later, Nzinga's name continues to hold a powerful place in Angolan history. Her life reminds us that resistance does not always look the same. Sometimes it is fought with weapons, sometimes with diplomacy, sometimes with patience, and sometimes with the determination to simply survive. Nzinga used all of them, and that is why her legacy endured long after the battles were over, and long after the queen herself was gone. Nzinga Mbande's story began with a princess, but it ended with a queen who had survived decades of war, diplomacy, political upheaval, and foreign pressure. She faced an empire that believed it could eventually control her. It never did. Nzinga negotiated when diplomacy could protect her people. She fought when resistance became necessary. She built alliances when she needed them. And when the opportunity for peace finally came, she used it to strengthen the kingdom she had spent her life defending. She was not simply a warrior, she was a strategist, a diplomat, a ruler, and a survivor. When Nzinga died in 1663, she left behind more than a throne. She left behind the memory of a woman who refused to allow a foreign power to decide the fate of her people. Centuries later, her story continues to inspire Angola and people around the world, because Nzinga's greatest victory was not a single battle. It was the fact that she endured. When powerful forces tried to defeat her, she adapted. When they tried to intimidate her, she negotiated. And when they tried to control her, she resisted. Queen Nzinga Mbande, a woman who turned resistance into a legacy, and whose name still stands as a symbol of African strength, courage, and determination. Thank you for watching, and thank you to TXA Studios for bringing this remarkable story to life.